It is the spring of 1915. The British Empire has a plan, a bold, sweeping, war-ending plan that will knock one of Germany's allies out of the war, open a sea route to Russia, and force the Central Powers to fight on yet another front. The strategists in London believe it will take a few weeks. They are sending an armada of over 200 warships and more than 70,000 men. British, Australian, New Zealand, French, the largest amphibious assault in the history of warfare up to that point. The target is a narrow strip of land barely 33 miles long, a peninsula in Ottoman Turkey called Gallipoli. And if it works, if the fleet breaks through the Dardanelles Strait and the army seizes the heights, the capital of the Ottoman Empire falls, Constantinople, and the war in the East changes forever. But it doesn't work. What follows is 9 months of some of the most brutal, grinding, and catastrophically mismanaged fighting of the entire First World War. By the time the Allies evacuate, quietly, in the dark, trying not to let the Ottomans hear them leave, over 56,000 Allied soldiers are dead, another 186,000 are wounded, and not a single one of the campaign's objectives has been achieved. This is not a story about courage. The men who fought here had courage in abundance. This is a story about why that courage was never enough. Because the men who sent them here made nearly every mistake it was possible to make. This is the Battle of Gallipoli. What you are about to see covers it all. The political gamble that launched the campaign, and the man whose career it nearly destroyed. The naval assault that came agonizingly close to success, and then stopped for reasons that still haunt historians. The amphibious landings where men were cut down before they ever left their boats. The suicidal charges up bridges that couldn't be taken. The disease, the flies, the dysentery, the snipers. The moment Allied commanders realized they had failed, and the extraordinary evacuation that saved what remained of their armies, and running through all of it, a single question: did the Allies lose Gallipoli, or did they throw it away? Welcome to Never Came Home, the channel that tells the First World War through the eyes of the men who fought it. To understand why Gallipoli happened, you first have to understand the Ottoman Empire in 1914 and why the British were so desperate to knock it out of the war. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of what it had once been. The empire that had stretched across 3 continents, that had besieged Vienna and dominated the Mediterranean, was now called, openly and without apology, the sick man of Europe. It had lost most of its territory in Europe. Its finances were a wreck. Its military had been humiliated in 2 Balkan wars between 1912 and 1913, and its political system was dominated by a faction of modernizing nationalists called the Committee of Union and Progress, better known as the Young Turks, who had seized effective control of the government in 1913. 3 men ran the Young Turks, and therefore ran the empire. Enver Pasha, the war minister. Young, vain, ambitious, deeply pro-German, who signed a secret alliance with Germany in August 1914. Talat Pasha, the interior minister. Calculating, ruthless, the real political brain. And Cemal Pasha, the naval minister. The secret alliance with Germany was exactly that, secret. Even most of the Ottoman government didn't know about it at first. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, the Ottomans officially declared neutrality, but Enver Pasha had no intention of staying neutral. In November 1914, Ottoman warships, commanded by a German admiral, flying Ottoman flags, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea without any declaration of war. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France followed. The Ottoman Empire was now in the war, and for the Allies this created a very serious problem. The problem was geography. Russia was an Allied power. Russia had an enormous army. But Russia was also running desperately short of ammunition, rifles, and military supplies. And the only way to get supplies to Russia in the winter of 1914 was through the Black Sea, which meant passing through the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus in the north, and in the south, the Dardanelles, the narrow channel that separated European Turkey from Asian Turkey and connected the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara. The Ottomans controlled both. This meant that Russia was effectively cut off from its Western allies at the moment it needed them most. Russia's situation was becoming desperate. In the winter of 1914 alone, Russian forces suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. The Tsar's government sent an urgent appeal to Britain: do something to relieve the pressure. At the same time, the Western Front in France had already solidified into the trenches that would come to define the war. The war of movement that everyone had expected was over. In its place was something that nobody knew how to fight: a continuous line of fortified trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, defended by machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery. Several members of the British War Council, among them the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, began looking for alternatives. What if, instead of continuing to throw men at the trenches in France, the Allies opened a new front? What if they knocked the Ottoman Empire out of the war, opened the route to Russia, and attacked Germany from the south? What if they took the Dardanelles? Churchill was particularly enthusiastic. He believed the naval operation could be done quickly. He was certain the Ottoman defenses were weaker than they appeared. He was wrong about both. On paper, the Allies had an overwhelming advantage. The Royal Navy was the most powerful fleet in the world. The Mediterranean Expeditionary Force that was eventually assembled numbered over 70,000 men, British, Anzac, and French. They had artillery, they had warships, they had supply lines across the Mediterranean, but they were fighting on the other side of the world from their industrial base. Every shell, every rifle round, every pound of food had to come by sea. Every casualty had to be evacuated by sea. And the sea was not always cooperative. The Ottoman forces defending the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli Peninsula were, at first glance, weaker. The Ottoman 6th Army Corps was responsible for the defense of the Dardanelles in early 1915. Many of its units were under-equipped, inadequately trained, and suffering from the same supply problems that plagued Ottoman forces everywhere. But they had something the Allies consistently underestimated. They were defending their own ground. The Gallipoli Peninsula is not flat. It is a tangled, ravine-cut, cliff-edged wilderness, covered in thick scrub that obscures the ground ahead and channels movement into killing grounds. The men defending it knew the terrain, the men attacking it did not, and the Ottomans had something else. They had a German advisor named Otto Lehmann von Sanders, appointed commander of the Ottoman Fifth Army in March 1915, just weeks before the Allied landings. Von Sanders immediately recognized the Allied intentions and began reorganizing the defenses accordingly. And they had, commanding one of their divisions, a 33-year-old lieutenant colonel who had fought in the Balkan Wars and who understood with absolute clarity that this peninsula could not be given up. His name was Mustafa Kemal. He would later become a Turk, the founder of modern Turkey, but in 1915 he was just a divisional commander and one of the most aggressive, decisive officers on either side of the battle. The original Allied plan was to use the navy alone. Churchill and the War Council convinced themselves that Ottoman forts along the Dardanelles could be silenced by naval gunfire, that the minefields in the strait could be swept clear, and that the fleet could then steam through to Constantinople. Once the fleet appeared off the Ottoman capital, they believed, the government would panic and sue for peace. This assumption rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of both the defenses and the psychology of the Ottoman leadership. The Dardanelles was not lightly defended. The strait was protected by a series of forts on both the European and Asian shores, not just at the mouth of the strait, but deep inside it at the Narrows, where the channel was less than a mile wide. The forts were armed with heavy guns, some of them German-supplied, modern, accurate. The channel itself was mined. Not one minefield, multiple minefields, layered, with new lines being added as fast as the Ottomans could lay them, and the mobile artillery, howitzers and field guns mounted on wheeled carriages that could move, disappear, and reappear at will, were almost impossible for naval gunfire to destroy. The naval commanders on the spot had doubts. Vice Admiral Sackville-Carden, who was initially in charge of the naval operation, warned London that the bombardment would take time and that the minefield problem was serious. London essentially ignored him and pushed for speed. On the ground side, the planning was equally muddled. General Sir Ian Hamilton was appointed to command the land forces in mid-March 1915, barely 3 weeks before the landings. He arrived at his headquarters without detailed maps of the peninsula, without adequate intelligence on Ottoman defenses, and with a staff that was making up the invasion plan from scratch. The landings themselves were assigned to 5 beaches at the southern tip of the peninsula, designated S, V, W, X, and Y, plus a separate Anzac landing further north on the Aegean coast. The assumption was that the landings would succeed quickly, that the Ottomans would be overwhelmed by numbers, and that the high ground could be seized within days. It was, to put it plainly, an extraordinarily optimistic plan for an extraordinarily difficult operation. The Allied naval campaign opened on February 19, 1915. British and French warships began bombarding the outer forts at the mouth of the Dardanelles. The opening bombardment seemed to go well. The outer forts were silenced, landing parties went ashore to destroy guns, and for a few days it looked as though the optimists in London might be right. Then the fleet moved deeper into the strait, and the problems began. The mobile artillery, the howitzers and field guns that the naval planners had assumed would be easy to destroy, were not easy to destroy. They would fire on the minesweepers, force them to retreat, and then disappear before the warships could locate them. The minesweepers themselves were a problem. They were converted civilian trawlers crewed by civilian fishermen who, when Ottoman gunfire swept across the strait at night, turned their vessels around and went back to the safety of the open sea. They were not soldiers. Nobody had thought to man the minesweepers with naval crews. The mines were not being cleared. For weeks the operation stalled. Carden suffered a nervous breakdown and was replaced by Vice Admiral Sir John de Robeck. On March 18, 1915, de Robeck launched what was intended to be the decisive assault. 16 battleships and 3 lines entered the strait. The early bombardment seemed to go well. Ottoman forts were silenced. De Robeck signaled his confidence to London. Then the disaster. The French battleship Bouvet hit a mine and sank in less than 2 minutes. Over 600 French sailors drowned. HMS Irresistible hit a mine. HMS Ocean hit a mine while trying to rescue Irresistible. Both sank. HMS Inflexible was badly damaged. 3 more battleships were put out of action. In a single afternoon, the Allied fleet had lost 6 capital ships, sunk or crippled. De Robeck ordered a withdrawal. And here is one of the great what-ifs of the First World War. When the Ottoman guns fell silent that afternoon, it was not because the defense had won. It was because they were almost out of ammunition. The shore batteries had expended nearly everything they had. The mines that sank the Allied ships were not the main defensive line. They were a line that had been laid parallel to the shore, outside the main field, and had been missed by Allied intelligence. Had de Robeck pressed forward the next day, or the day after, the Ottoman defenders may have had almost nothing left to stop him. He did not know this. His orders were to press on, but his nerve, and the nerve of his senior officers, was broken. He requested that the army take the peninsula before the navy tried again. The decision to wait for the army cost the Allies the one moment when pure naval action might have succeeded. April 25, 1915. Before dawn, in the darkness of the Aegean Sea, tens of thousands of men climbed down the sides of troopships into small boats. The Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, were heading for a beach north of Gaba-Tepe on the Aegean coast of the peninsula. The British were heading for the beaches at Cape Helles at the southern tip. The Anzac landing went wrong from the very first moment. The boats drifted north in the darkness, pushed by a current that the planners hadn't accounted for. Instead of landing on the gentle slope of Brighton Beach, a relatively manageable terrain, the Anzacs came ashore at the base of steep, broken cliffs. The beach was barely 30 yards wide. Above them, the ground rose in a chaos of ravines and ridges. They came ashore anyway. Private Edward Betts of the 1st Australian Division was among the first men to reach the beach. We scrambled out of the boats and into the water, waist-deep for some, chest-deep for others. The fire started before we reached the shore. Men were going down around me. I didn't look back. There was no direction to go but forward and up. They went forward and up. Some of them reached the first ridge, Pluggy's Plateau, by mid-morning. Some pushed even further, almost to the high ground of Chunuk Bair. But they were disorganized, spread across broken ground in small groups, with no clear line of communication back to the commanders on the ships. And Mustafa Kemal was already moving. When Kemal received reports of the landing, he didn't wait for orders. He ordered the entire 57th Infantry Regiment to advance, without even being fully sure where the enemy was. He found some of his own men retreating. He reportedly stopped them and said, "I am not ordering you to attack. I am ordering you to die. And the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." The 57th Regiment advanced. They met the Anzacs on the ridges. The fighting was close, savage, and merciless. By nightfall, the Anzacs had been pushed back from everything they'd gained. They were clinging to a narrow, cliff-backed beachhead, a perimeter that would not meaningfully expand for the next 8 months. At Cape Helles, things were worse. At V Beach, the largest of the southern landings, the plan involved running an old collier, the River Clyde, directly onto the beach and pouring men out through holes cut in its sides. The Ottomans had no artillery covering the beach itself, but they had rifles, machine guns, and a clear field of fire. When the River Clyde grounded and the doors opened, the men who poured out were cut down by the hundreds before they reached the shore. The water turned red. Officers who tried to lead men forward were shot within seconds. The beach became a killing ground. Corporal William Lester, Royal Dublin Fusiliers, was one of the men who made it ashore. "I don't know how I crossed. I was moving and the men beside me were falling. There was no cover. There was nowhere to go but into it. I ran because stopping meant dying, and even running barely helped." By the end of April 25, the Allies had landed on Gallipoli. That much was true. But they had not seized the high ground. They had not broken the Ottoman line, and they were holding two narrow, exposed, overlooked beachheads, not a bridgehead from which to advance. The weeks that followed, April 25 established a pattern that would hold for the rest of the campaign. The Allies would mount an attack. The Ottomans would resist, counterattack, and ultimately hold their positions on the high ground. Casualties would be severe on both sides. Nothing of significance would change on the map. At Cape Helles, British forces attempted to advance toward the village of Krithia and the heights of Achi Baba, the dominant terrain feature at the southern end of the peninsula, 3 separate times in May and June. First Battle of Krithia, Second Battle of Krithia, Third Battle of Krithia, all 3 failed. Achi Baba was never taken. The problem was not the courage of the men, it was the arithmetic of the ground. The Ottoman defenders held the high ground and could observe every Allied movement across the peninsula. Allied attacks had to advance uphill, across open terrain, into prepared defensive positions. The men who led these attacks were not unaware of the difficulty, they simply had no alternative to offer. The orders came down and the men went forward. General Sir Frederick Stopford, who commanded the 9th Corps at Suvla Bay in August 1915, would become the most criticized commander of the campaign, and for good reason. When a fresh landing at Suvla Bay in August offered the best chance the Allies had of seizing the high ground before the Ottomans reinforced, a landing that went almost unopposed in its first hours, Stopford ordered his men to stop, consolidate, and wait. He sat on his headquarters ship. He did not go ashore. He did not push his commanders to advance. In the hours that his corps rested on the beach, the Ottomans moved troops into the hills above them. By the time the British finally advanced, the heights were defended. Hamilton, watching the situation deteriorate from his own headquarters ship, failed to override Stopford with enough urgency until it was too late. General Hamilton later wrote in his diary, "Had Stopford pushed his men inland on the night of the 6th, the whole campaign might have been redeemed, but he did not push and they did not go, and the moment, the one great unrepeatable moment, passed." By midsummer 1915, Gallipoli had become something that none of its planners had envisioned, and none of its soldiers had been prepared for. It had become a siege. The Allied beachheads were measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. Men lived in trenches dug into chalk and rock, sometimes within throwing distance of the Ottoman lines. The heat was ferocious, temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The flies were everywhere. The flies were not a minor inconvenience. They were a catastrophe. The bodies of dead men lay unburied in no man's land. There was no way to retrieve them under fire. The flies bred in the corpses, in the latrines, in the food. Dysentery spread through both sides with almost no resistance. Private Cyril Lawrence, a sapper in the Australian 1st Field Squadron, wrote in his diary in July 1915, "The flies are unbearable. They cover everything, your food the instant you open it, your hands, your face. Men are sick constantly. Half the battalion is on the rolls as sick at any given moment. We are fighting the Turks and the flies and the heat and the water shortage all at once, and I am no longer sure which is killing us faster." The snipers were another constant. Ottoman snipers were among the most skilled in the campaign, and the ground, broken, covered in scrub, gave them countless positions. Men who lifted their heads above the parapet died. Men who moved carelessly along communication trenches died. The snipers were patient, methodical, and almost impossible to locate. Medical facilities were entirely inadequate for the scale of the casualties. Hospital ships in the harbor were overwhelmed within days of the initial landing. Wounded men lay on the beaches for hours, sometimes days, before they could be evacuated. Men who might have survived with prompt treatment died waiting. By July 1915, the Allies had suffered over 50,000 casualties and had advanced perhaps a mile from their original landing positions. The men endured. That is the word that appears again and again in the letters and diaries of Gallipoli veterans. They did not win. They endured. August 1915 was the Allied High Command's last serious attempt to break the deadlock. The plan was ambitious, arguably the most complex military operation the British had attempted up to that point in the war. A new landing at Suvla Bay, north of the Anzac perimeter, would draw Ottoman attention and seize the undefended terrain around Suvla Lake. Simultaneously, the Anzacs would launch a major night attack out of their perimeter, toward the Sari Bear Ridge and its highest point, Hill 971, and toward Chunuk Bair, the same ground they had nearly reached on the first day of the campaign. If Chunuk Bair could be seized and held, the entire Ottoman defensive position at Anzac Cove would be overlooked, and the campaign might finally have a chance of success. The Anzac night attack was extraordinary. Men moving through pitch-black ravines they barely knew, maintaining formation, fighting their way upward in the dark toward ridges held by Ottoman troops. On August 8, after 2 days of fighting, New Zealand troops under Lieutenant Colonel William Malone actually seized Chunuk Bair. They held it for 2 days. Malone was killed by friendly artillery fire while defending the position. The New Zealanders who held Chunuk Bair after him were eventually overwhelmed by a massive Ottoman counterattack on August 10. Mustafa Kemal once again commanded the decisive Ottoman response. He described the moment of the counterattack himself. I stood at the head of the line and gave the order to advance. I told my men they were not charging to fight. They were charging to die. A soldier who is willing to die cannot be stopped. The New Zealanders were swept from Chunuk Bair. The Allied line fell back, and at Suvla Bay, Stoppard's corps had done nothing. The August offensive, the campaign's last genuine hope, had failed. The failure at Gallipoli did not stay on the peninsula. In London, the consequences were political and immediate. The coalition government of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith was already under pressure. The shell shortage scandal, the revelation that British forces in France were desperately short of artillery ammunition, had damaged the government's credibility. Now came Gallipoli. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Jackie Fisher, resigned in May 1915, partly in protest at the continued commitment to the naval campaign. Fisher was 74 years old, erratic, and had opposed the Dardanelles operation from the beginning. His resignation was the visible crack in a structural failure. Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was the political face of the campaign. He was removed from office in May 1915. He was offered the sinecure of the Duchy of Lancaster, a cabinet post with no actual power. He accepted it, briefly, and then resigned to go to the Western Front as an infantry officer. Churchill wrote after his removal, "I had staked everything on this operation. I believed it was right. I believe it now. But I had asked for bold action and received hesitation, and the hesitation at the crucial moments cost us everything we had invested." The naval commanders on the ground, de Robeck and his successor, never attempted another major naval assault on the strait. The mines were never cleared. The Narrows were never forced. While the Allies were managing defeat, the Ottomans were managing something very different. The defense of Gallipoli became, for the Ottoman Empire, one of the defining national stories of the entire war, and Mustafa Kemal became its defining figure. Kemal's approach to command was simple and brutal. Ground was not to be given up, not a meter, not a foot, whatever the cost. This produced extraordinary Ottoman casualties. The Ottomans suffered at least 218,000 dead and wounded in the campaign, possibly more. In some engagements, Ottoman units were effectively destroyed in place before they would retreat. But it also produced a defense that never broke. German advisor Otto Lehmann von Sanders, who commanded the overall Ottoman forces, was an experienced professional soldier who understood the strategic situation clearly. He later wrote, "The Allied forces were stronger in materiel, stronger in artillery at many points, and better supplied from the sea. What they could not overcome was the determination of the defenders and the ground itself. Every advance met a prepared position on higher terrain. Every landing was observed. There was nowhere on that peninsula from which the Ottomans did not hold the advantage of elevation. The Ottomans also benefited from something the Allies could not replicate: short interior supply lines. Reinforcements and ammunition could be moved to the peninsula by land. The Allies had to bring everything across open water. By autumn 1915, the Ottoman defenders had been reinforced to the point that no Allied operation on the peninsula had any realistic chance of success. By October 1915, the British government had reached a conclusion that it had resisted for months. Gallipoli could not be won. The argument now was about whether to evacuate, and how. Some commanders warned that an evacuation under fire would cost as many lives as the initial landing. Hamilton himself estimated that an evacuation might cost 50% casualties. Hamilton was replaced by General Sir Charles Monro, who visited the peninsula, assessed the situation, and recommended immediate evacuation. Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, visited Gallipoli himself in November 1915. He agreed. The evacuation was organized with a meticulous care that the original landings had entirely lacked. Over several weeks in December 1915 and January 1916, using a rotating system of nighttime withdrawals, the Allies removed 83,000 men from the Anzac and Suvla positions and 35,000 men from Cape Helles. They used dummy rifles, devices that fired automatically at intervals to simulate normal defensive fire. They used drip tins with slowly emptying water to trigger rifle shots long after the men had gone. They moved at night, in silence. The Ottomans did not realize what was happening until the last men were already gone. The evacuation was the most successful part of the entire Gallipoli campaign. Not a single man was lost in the withdrawal. Private Orhan Mehmed, an Ottoman infantryman who entered the Allied trenches at Anzac Cove after the evacuation, described what he found. The trenches were empty. Everything was left: food, equipment, tin cups still smelling of tea. We walked through and there was no one there. I could not understand it. The day before there were thousands of them, and the night they had simply vanished. The Battle of Gallipoli killed more than 56,000 Allied soldiers and more than 56,000 Ottoman soldiers. Another 400,000 men on both sides were wounded or incapacitated by disease, and it accomplished nothing that it set out to accomplish. The Dardanelles were never opened. Russia never received the supplies and the sea route that the campaign was supposed to provide. The Ottoman Empire was not knocked out of the war. Constantinople did not fall. Russia, cut off from its allies and hemorrhaging men on the Eastern Front, continued to deteriorate, until the revolution in 1917 brought it out of the war entirely. The consequences rippled outward. Churchill was politically ruined. For years, he spent the rest of the war in relative obscurity, rebuilding his reputation slowly. He would eventually return to government and, a quarter century later, lead Britain to a different war. But Gallipoli followed him for the rest of his life. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became something different, something almost sacred. April 25 is still commemorated as Anzac Day in both countries. It is the day that defines for many Australians and New Zealanders what their nations are, not because they won, but because of how they fought when they were losing. For Turkey, Gallipoli became a founding myth of the modern nation. Mustafa Kemal, the man who stopped the Allies on the ridges above Anzac Cove, who stood at the head of the 57th Regiment and told them to die, went on to abolish the Sultanate, found the Republic of Turkey, and transform an empire's ruins into a modern state. The defense of Gallipoli was, in Turkish national memory, the moment that modern Turkey began. For the British Army, Gallipoli was a masterclass in how not to conduct an operation, and many of its lessons were eventually absorbed, painfully, into the doctrine that made the Allied victories of 1918 possible. But perhaps the sharpest lesson of Gallipoli is this: the campaign came close, agonizingly close, to succeeding at multiple points. The Ottoman forts were nearly out of ammunition on March 18 when de Robeck withdrew. The high ground was nearly seized on April 25 before Kemal moved. Shunup was actually taken in August, and then lost. The Allies did not lose Gallipoli because the task was impossible. They lost it because of hesitation at critical moments, because of commanders who would not push when pushing was necessary, because of planning that underestimated the enemy and overestimated their own speed. The men in the trenches did not fail at Gallipoli. The men who sent them there did. The 57th Ottoman Infantry Regiment that Mustafa Kemal ordered to advance and die on April 25, 1915 was effectively destroyed in the fighting that followed. Almost every man in the regiment was killed. There is a memorial to them at Gallipoli today. It reads in part, "Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace." The words were written by Mustafa Kemal himself, addressed to the Allied dead buried on the peninsula. He added, "You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." If you want to go deeper on Gallipoli, the detailed accounts of individual engagements, the letters of the soldiers, the political fallout in London, the sources for this episode are listed in the description below. If this video gave you something, an understanding, a feeling, a name you'll remember, consider sharing it. That's how this channel grows. Until next time, never came home.